And Julius Caesar was one of like the great authors. He did content. If it had been 2,000 years later, he would have had a podcast. That's how important being able to communicate and get your message out is. If you want to get to the top and whatever you do, being able to communicate that to other people allows you to lead them and allows you to do more. Because Steve Jobs, right? Like the great product visionary of our era. And yet he still defined himself primarily by the people that he put around him. If you can have that one goal that you're pursuing no matter what, and you just don't get distracted at all, you never think about anything else except for pursuing that one goal, then there's a lot that you can accomplish, and you can pass up a lot of people who might be more talented than you.
All right. Well, Ben, welcome to the podcast. I appreciate you hopping on today.
Thanks for having me, Tim.
Yeah, and I know it's for you guys who don't know, Ben has his own podcast, which we're gonna jump right into it. And now it's for you. You're kind of on the other side of talking versus talking into your own podcast. But your podcast is How to Take Over the World, and I would love to learn more about how you started your podcast, because I think the idea is super interesting. I did a lot of research into like different people and times you talk about, but I'll leave it to you to explain.
Yeah, certainly. So, it started 4 or 5 years ago, and the company I was working for just had sold. I was redundant, so now I was out of the company, and I was just at home, kicking the sand, cooling my heels, figuring out what to do with my life. And I thought I would read a little bit and try and get some inspiration. And it started with, so I was reading this book on Napoleon Bonaparte, the one by Andrew Roberts, really good biography of Napoleon. At the same time, I was getting in podcasts were already a thing, but I was listening a lot to the Tim Ferriss podcast, and he just had a streak of like 5 or 6 shows in a row where I thought, I'm not really interested in any of these people. And so I just kind of had the thought, well, who would I like to listen to Tim Ferriss interview? And I had this biography I was reading. I was like, I would love it if Tim could interview Napoleon. And then I just thought, I could do this. Why can't I do that? And so that was kind of the genesis of the idea of my podcast was, what if Tim Ferriss could interview Napoleon, Caesar, Thomas Edison, like great inventors, businessmen, scientists, conquerors from history. And so that led to me starting How to Take Over the World, which is what it sounds like a little bit. It's biographies of famous people and kind of what we can learn from them. So I'm a few years deep now, and it's been a great process.
Yeah, that's amazing. And so tell me about some of your more popular biographies of people you've done, or maybe it's the most interesting to you, but I think there's so many out there. So obviously if you guys are watching this and are curious on this, definitely go check out Ben's podcast. But, a lot of people who are hearing this for the first time, they're probably curious, like, what does that mean? What does that look like when Ben is talking about some of these key historical figures?
Yeah, well, asking me to pick my favorites is a little bit like asking someone to pick their favorite child, right? It's always hard to cut any of them out.
Yeah.
But yeah, so to give people kind of a feel for what it's about. So for example, for Napoleon, I've actually done a couple episodes on him now. And it's not only, I'll cover his life and I'll talk about his origins and the major battles he was a part of and how he reformed France and built the French Empire and the wars that led to his rise, the wars that led to his fall. But I'll also talk about, for example, I read this book called Napoleon, How He Did It, by one of his private secretaries, actually, this guy named Baron Fane. And so this guy was a private secretary of his and observed every day exactly how he worked. And so it's a book all about just how he organizes his desk, how he organizes his executive team, how he writes, how he dictates his letters, how he sends out commands, how he receives information, how he structures his day. So it's not just the biographical details, but it's also...
Wow. And so like, what were some of those peculiar things that you've picked, or what are some interesting things that you didn't know about when doing research on Napoleon?
Well, there's a lot. Like everyone, I didn't know anything about how he worked, right? So I can tell you one thing that I actually changed about how I worked based on what he did.
Yep.
So one of those things was, I thought it was really interesting the way he dictated letters. So he was all about, I have this huge empire that goes all the way to Northern Europe, to like the tip of Denmark, all the way down to Sicily in Southern Europe, all the way from Spain in the west to Russia in the east. They had colonies in the Americas, in Haiti and Louisiana, in Quebec. And so he had this like vast empire, millions of people that he had to manage. And he was managing every aspect of it: the army, the navy, yes, the military, but also the schools, the roads. And he was like intimately involved in all of those details. And so he had to be hyper efficient. So for example, this guy Baron Fane talks about how he would pick up a letter and read the letter, and then he would dictate a response, and then he would let the letter drop from his hand. He wouldn't even take the effort to like crumple it up and throw it to the side, because he just needed to be as efficient as possible. So he just literally drops it, picks up a new one, and then later someone else comes in and picks it up. So and he early in his career would write, but quickly he found there was too much to do, and so he stopped writing and he only dictated. And he had secretaries that would cycle through because it was too much for one person to keep up with, to be taking down his dictation all day. So I started thinking about this. I'm like, man, it's pretty powerful if you can just use voice dictation all the time. You can be much more efficient. And so what I started doing is, when reading and taking notes for these podcast episodes, now instead of actually reading and writing down notes and highlighting stuff, I just set a recorder down, and it's voice activated. So if I say anything, it starts recording. And if I read a quote I like, I just say it out loud. I just dictate it. Or if I have thoughts, I just speak them like I'm a crazy person speaking into the universe. And this recorder picks it up, and then I have it automatically transcribed through software. And so then I just have a perfect transcript of all the notes I take, and I don't have to take the time to actually write them down. I'm just speaking, and it's helped me be way more efficient in terms of reading and taking notes. So it's like little things like that I picked up on.
That's amazing. And the voice recorder, it doesn't start recording until you talk. So even if you pause for a little bit.
Well, yeah, because I'm pausing, it'll be like 15, 20 minutes sometimes between notes, right? So It's not recording that dead space. Yeah.
Gotcha. That's amazing. And so what's your process to prep for specific people that you want to research? Because I know that I'm sure that a ton goes into that, because some of your episodes, you have part 1, part 2, part 3, part 4 of studying people. And I'm sure sometimes you may not you can't just easily find research on certain people as well. So.
Yeah, I mean, most of the people I cover tend to be major figures. I've only done 1 or 2 that you could in any way consider niche. So my process is essentially, I'll read a biography, and then I always want to read a second biography, because I want to triangulate my own opinion, if that makes sense. So I read 2 biographies so that if there's any dispute or if there's any just like kind of different way to think about this person, I'm kind of getting it from 2 sides, so that I feel like on a certain level, I'm starting to develop a unique perspective and not just digesting what someone else thought about this person. So 2 biographies. Then I also try and read a 3rd book, usually on like the time period or the area, like something that gives me more context for the world around them and what was happening, and major kind of changes in technology, politics, whatever. And then I kind of look and see if there's any gaps, anything I want to know that I don't know yet. And if that's the case, then I just warm up my Google fingers and start looking for research and try and find answers to those specific individual questions. So the whole time that I'm doing that, again, I'm just kind of speaking out these notes, and then I have them all transcribed at the end, and I dump them into one big doc. And then my process from there is I read through those notes live and record myself listening to or looking at my own notes. And then as I'm looking at them, I'm kind of saying what I find interesting, and I'm kind of starting to think about how I'm going to script this. And so from that basically turns into a rough draft of a script. So I hand that off. I have an editor who does a little bit of editing on that to fix it up. Then I'll give it a pass, and then I've basically got a script that I can record.
Wow. So your first draft is basically you just talking about your notes and thoughts as you see it.
That's right. And then I read that first draft for my second draft.
Amazing. Amazing. And your editor will help formulate first between the first and second draft and make things more structured or organized or more smooth, essentially.
That's right. And certain times, I'll be calling stuff out. I'll say, hey, oh, this is interesting. Da 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 da. I love this quote. This actually would go better 2 sections earlier. So let's put that there. And giving a little bit of instruction, stuff like that. Yeah.
Got it. That's amazing. I think that process is spot on. So I know you've covered some people that I was like, wow, I'm interested in learning more about this person. So I think one very interesting person.
The first is, and they might do crazy things, right? And so on a certain level, now he did have a lot to lose because he, by the time he gets into the Civil War, which is like the climactic battle of his life for control of Rome, he's obviously accumulated a lot of wealth and a lot of possessions and a lot of power. But at the same time, there's this famous story where they're coming back from a certain war and they're going through this little mountain village where it's really, really poverty-stricken and poor and nothing going on. And Rome is the predominant city in the world at the time. And so some people are making fun of this little village in his army. And he silences them and he says, I would rather be the first man, I'd rather be the most powerful man in this village than the second man in Rome. Okay? Now, like we hear that and we're like, oh, Caesar. But like, just think about that. I want you to think about how insane of a person you would have to be for us to be walking. Like, this is like the third world, Tim, right? Like you and me, Tim, we're walking through like some bombed out village in Syria, right? That has just been through a civil war. And I'm like, man, it sucks for the people that live here. And you're like, yeah, but I would rather be the top G. I'd rather be like the top guy in this little bombed out village in Syria than the number 2 person in New York City, right? You're an insane person if you believe that. And he was an insane person, right? Like he just had to win. He was compulsive. So that was one takeaway from the life of Julius Caesar. I think the other thing that goes along with that a little bit is he wins this war. And the way that he behaves is kind of interesting because there's been civil wars for a few years in Rome at this point. And one side will win and they go, and once they win, they kill all their enemies and they take all their stuff. And they're the victors for a while. And then a few years later, tensions flare up and the other side might win this time and they kill all their enemies and they take all their stuff. And there's all these recriminations that happen after these civil wars. And that's kind of what everyone expects. And Julius Caesar immediately is just like, that's not happening this time. It's not happening this time. There are going to be no recriminations. And you're not going to kill anyone. You're not going to take their stuff. Now, on the one hand, that might seem noble, right? It might seem nice, but he wasn't being nice. It was that he actually had more ambition than the people that came before him. So the ambition of the people before him was, I'm coming into this in order to win, in order to protect myself, in order to make sure my people like come out well. Julius Caesar was saying, I own Rome. Like, you're not taking stuff out on the other side because I own them too. Like, this is actually all my stuff. And so, like, we're not going to damage that stuff. You're not going to horse around in my family room. I own Rome. And so, like, just taking that ownership attitude of, like, actually, we're not going to have any recriminations because, like, this is all my stuff, I think is really smart. And so, like, increase the scope of your ambitions and truly take ownership rather than like just taking revenge and having these like little petty victories. And
it's almost comparable to like thinking long term, right? The story you just presented, it's people are thinking very short term. Let me just conquer the city. I prove that I'm strong. I'm the best person. And then boom, you burn everything. Versus he took the long term approach, which is this is part of me building a massive army and empire. So,
Right. And I think the third thing I would highlight is most people know Caesar as a conqueror. What many people don't know is that when he was doing his first big campaign in Gaul, he was writing these dispatches back to Rome and saying, kind of talking about the victories that he won and the stuff that he was seeing, because this is a very foreign country that most Romans had never been to. And this was actually like the top selling literature of his time.
that's amazing. So he was a great publisher and author back then, one of the most prominent ones. See, these are things
right.
that you don't know about if you don't do it. But I love how you explain it in terms of translating it back to present time. And I also don't want to cap you at 3. If there's other things that you've taken away from his biography and how it relates back to present time, I think this is a very interesting topic that we're on.
No, I mean, the other thing that is just interesting about Caesar, that is interesting about all these people, that I just find so interesting, was he loved to host and have these big feasts, because that was what you did back then, right? That was a big part of demonstrating that you had money, that you were powerful, that you could be a patron of others. But he would hardly eat at these feasts. You know, everyone always observed, like, oh, Caesar, how come you have this big elaborate feast and yet you yourself are kind of barely eating? And it was because his mind was just always on conquest, getting to the top. He was obsessed, right? And so you see this a lot, that like Napoleon was a super light eater. And he has this famous quote where he says, if you want to eat poorly, eat with Lebrun. It's one of his kind of lieutenants. If you want to eat well, eat with Camposaris. That's another one of his lieutenants. But if you want to eat quickly, eat with me. Because he would just eat for 10 minutes and then like he was back on to work, right? And Joan of Arc was a super light eater. Steve Jobs, of course, he would go on like fruitarian and apple only diets. He was like a super light eater. He was a vegan his entire life. Leonardo da Vinci was a vegan. It's like all these guys eat super light because they're obsessed. And so just food is getting in the way, right? And they're like, what's the least amount I can eat to fuel me and then like get back to what I'm obsessed with doing.
So I know you also did Steve Jobs as well. And Steve Jobs is, obviously someone a lot more people who are listening are more familiar with in terms of relevancy of time frame as well, being able to grow up in that era. What would you say were a few things that you learned about Steve Jobs that was basically that you're like, wow, that makes sense why he got to where he was?
Yeah, I think so. I just read a new book on Steve Jobs called Make Something Wonderful, Steve Jobs in His Own Words. So Steve Jobs Archive, they just went back and they took everything they could find of Steve in his own voice. So that was like magazine, TV interviews, emails that he had sent, presentations he had been given, memos he had written, anything they could find of Steve in his own words, and they just compiled it into a book. So it's just like all Steve just talking. And there was some interesting stuff that I came away with. One is kind of how he defines the job of a top leader, of a CEO. So he says that, and then setting that vision and helping them achieve that. So he didn't give himself a lot of the credit for that. So I thought that was like a really good, concise way to think about leadership. I was just like, oh, okay, checklist. Do I have the right people around me? Have I set the vision for them? And am I doing a good job of like pushing them towards achieving that vision? The other thing was he was really good about accountability. And it was interesting the way that he did accountability, because often they were not like set metrics. He didn't spend a long time thinking about the goals, and like, how do we precisely define these goals? So you'd see the goals all the time would be like, he'd be the head of Pixar, and one of the goals would be like, make sure that there's like a ton of press about A Bug's Life when it comes out. And it's like, how do you define that? And yet the fact that they don't spend a lot of time thinking about like, oh, well, how do we define that? And what's the measurements? Like, who cares, man? We all know if we're doing it or not, right? And then he follows up a year later and is like, look, he didn't, once again, did not cite any particular metrics, but he was like, look, this was the #1 performing movie in the country. It was on the second page of the New York Times, its review. They were effusive about it. Like, clearly this press initiative worked. And so that to me was...
Yeah, see, he's painted as a big product visionary, but yet the number one thing from your research is recruiting people. So
Yeah, exactly. I think for Steve, another thing that blew me away in this latest reread through his life was, you know, I think he grew up in the 60s, you know, at a time when people were really, really idealistic. And so he had these really strong ideals, and he was an artist at heart, and he believed that things should be really beautiful. And I just see a lot of that idealism being lost. You know, even when I was growing up, there was this feeling of selling out, and there was a difference between selling out and doing things for money and not selling out and doing things for pure artistic purposes and love and whatever else. And it seems like that's gone. No one talks about selling out anymore. Like everyone's attitude is, well, you know, make some money if you can, whatever. And so I think that idealism is really important and something that people should focus on recapturing. Another thing that stood out to me about Steve Jobs was this was someone who was a master communicator, just like Caesar was, right? So he has all these great analogies. And there's some that everyone knows. So like when the original iPod he comes out, he says, it's 1,000 songs in your pocket. Okay? It's just a great analogy, great way to think about what an iPod is and how it will improve your life. Another one he's famous for is a bicycle of the mind. So he says, you know, if you look at what animals are most efficient in terms of how they move, humans are not very efficient in terms of calories spent per mile moved. It turns out birds are the most efficient. Humans are kind of somewhere in the middle. But if you put a human on the bicycle, all of a sudden humans on bikes do become the most efficient animal in terms of miles moved per calorie spent. And he said, personal computers are like a bicycle for the mind. They just make you make your mind go so much further. You can do so much more. It enhances the powers of your mind to make you more efficient. I thought that's like a beautiful analogy for the 70s when people don't even know what a computer is or why you would need one. It's really smart. I also uncovered some other analogies that I had never heard. So one of them, he talks about, someone asks him why he cares so much about the design of his computers, of like the box that they're in, how they're presented. And he says, most Americans don't own a computer. Again, this is like the 70s, early 80s. And he said, in 25 years, all of them will. But right now, Americans are on a first date with computers. And so in the same way that you would want to dress up for a first date, we need to dress these up in a certain way to present a certain image so that we can develop a certain relationship with people going forward. And I thought that was like such a clever way, the idea of a first date, to present what was happening between the relationship between America and computers at the time. And he had another of other ones. I'll tell you one other one, which was he talks about, he was also a student of history. He knew history super well. And he talked about the development of the telegraph, and how at first people thought, oh, this is great. Everyone's going to need a telegraph on their desk so that you can tap messages to people, you know. And he said, but the problem was that required everyone to learn Morse code. It only takes about 30 hours to learn Morse code. You could learn it in a week if that's all you did. But most people just weren't going to do that. And he said, so the real innovation was telephones, because telephones you could just pick up and speak, and you didn't have to learn anything new. And he said the great thing about telephones is not only could you speak, you could sing. You could add flavor and intonation and art into what you were saying. And then he says, IBMs are telegraphs of our age. They require you to learn programming. They require you to learn this new language in order to communicate with others. And the Macintosh is the telephone, because you don't have to learn anything new. You can just point and click, and you can communicate and do new things. And not only that, but you can sing. You can use different fonts. You can create things actually creatively and put your personality into it. I thought that was just like such an amazing way to express the difference between Macintoshes and IBMs at the time. So that's one of the big things that I'm learning from Steve Jobs is just use analogy to take something abstract and put it in a way that people will understand and connect with.
I really, really like that because I think when you're, especially for Steve, ahead of his time, right? Most people won't be able to grasp what he's thinking about or can't even envision it. But I think once you make an analogy to something present that most people understand, it makes it a lot more relatable and easier to understand.
Totally.
So that's great. So I know another person you interviewed with, or that you did a ton of research on, was Vladimir Putin, which he is obviously in his own island, and he arguably, I think, might be one of, if not the richest person in the world. Like, I think the richest people in the world aren't really on these Forbes 400 lists. Nobody knows their net worth. So I would love to learn more about what your takeaways were Vladimir Putin, because he's almost on the other side where you don't necessarily, he's not like he's prominent, but he's not like a Steve Jobs where it's inspiring, but he's yet still very successful at what he does. Yet it's very polarizing.
I think for me, the big takeaway from Vladimir Putin, and obviously I'm going to set aside kind of a lot of stuff. Obviously, he's an extremely controversial figure right now, understandably. And, it's not a politics show, so I don't like to dive into any of that. I actually was going to kind of restart the Putin series and talk about more of what has happened. But then it's just impossible to kind of get into some of these more recent happenings without making people upset one way or another. So I decided to kind of abandon it. But, for me, the interesting thing about Putin was he's coming up through the Russian civil service. First, he's coming up through the KGB, and then the KGB kind of comes to an end. And so he gets in with the mayor's office of St. Petersburg. And then the mayor loses his reelection, this guy Sobchak. And it's interesting because he comes to this crossroads when the mayor he was working for loses. And he didn't know what to do with his life because he'd been fired. He wasn't really going anywhere. He wasn't like on a meteoric rise. No one was like, oh, this Putin guy, watch out for him. Like, whatever. He was just kind of doing his thing. Just kind of being a mid-level functionary. And so, he's out of a job at age 40, or maybe he's like 45. I think it's 40. And he says, all right, well, maybe I'll start a judo gym. That's what he was going to do. And then he happens to get this low-level job in Moscow for the federal government over there. And his rise kind of starts again. And so it's interesting to me to think about, all right, so this is not, in my mind, someone that was destined for greatness. I'm not even trying to talk bad about him. I'm not saying he's stupid or anything, but he's not a genius. At the very least, I think we can say about him. He's not a genius. He's smart. He is a smart guy. Of course he's smart. To do what he's done, he's smart, but he's not a genius. What has enabled that rise has just been this extreme commitment to one purpose, right? And especially at a time, you get into the 90s and it really feels like the Soviet Union ends. Russia's in a really bad state. People are looting it. Have all these oligarchs that are coming on and just stripping the country for parts and really just robbing people blind. And he had an opportunity to get in on some of that. He did get in on some of that. But at the same time, he had just this like real firm commitment to the Russian state. And the fact that he just stayed committed to that, stayed on message, and just pursued single-mindedly one single goal allowed him to rise past a lot of people who might have been smarter, who might have been more charismatic, who might have had more connections, whatever. I think a lot of people can learn from that.
Interesting. The power of focus, really.
Yeah, that's right.
So even in his 40s, even when basically he had to restart from quote unquote scratch, then he just was very focused on moving up in Russia and in the government and really, getting to him where he is today. So
yeah, that's right. And I tried to choose my words carefully. Like, I wouldn't say that this is like a bleeding heart. Someone who's like, no, I just want to serve the Russian people. No, he's a KGB man. Like, he loved the Russian state.
Yep.
He loved the idea of like Mother Russia, right? And so he just was always faithful to that idea. And that's what took him where he got.
Got it. That's amazing. See, it's focused. I think there's just learning lessons from everyone, you know. And I think so that I guess that brings me to my next question is, what would you say were a few universal factors or traits that you saw that basically all, if not most, of these prominent figures had?
So that's like probably the most important thing, is just knowing what's most important and focusing on it and blocking out everything else. Other things like after focus, I would say vision. That's what all these people did, is they established a vision. And, you know, you think about Steve Jobs and Steve Wozniak, and Steve Wozniak is the engineering genius. He's the one who actually built the Apple II. He's the one who could actually do the stuff. And yet when Steve Jobs leaves, Steve Wozniak sticks around at Apple, it really flounders. And then when Steve Jobs comes back, Wozniak is gone, and yet he's able to resurrect it. And it's like, whoa, how is that possible that Steve Jobs is more important to the company than Steve Wozniak when he can't build a computer? And it's because vision is the most important thing. And so he had that vision. So first I would say focus. Second, I would say vision. Third, I would say courage. Like another thing, you know, Napoleon says that like calm under duress is essentially the most important attribute in an officer. And I think that's true. There are a lot of people who are able to have a vision and are able to march steadily towards it. And then when something happens, it's harder. You know, Mike Tyson says everyone has a plan until they get punched in the face. And it's true. Like having that discipline of, oh my gosh, I just got punched in the face. This hurts. This sucks. But I'm going to stay focused and I'm going to stick to the plan. That is what separates people. You think about a lot of investors, that's true. Like there are a lot of people who are good investors until a recession and things start going wrong, and then they panic and they do the wrong thing. Or until things start going great and then they get greedy and they abandon their principles, right? And they and like maybe they deploy all their capital when they know they shouldn't, and they stop preparing for bad times in the future or whatever. So it's like when something happens that would knock other people off of their plan, that's kind of what separates the greats from those who aren't great. Yeah, so those are some of the top lessons I've learned.
Got it. It's so interesting you say that, because even I think in today's day and age, when you see people who are successful, the same principles apply, right? You have to be focused, especially now more than ever. There's so many things that are distracting us. You might have one business idea, you might be getting traction there, and next thing you know, you have another business opportunity, or you have this thing and you can't decide. But as I get deeper into business myself, all of these things that you just brought up are extremely crucial.
Yeah, I think so. I think another thing that just comes to mind as you're talking was taking ownership and figuring stuff out no matter what. There's a great story I love about the Rothschilds, that they set up these 5 banks all over Europe, in Germany, Italy, England, France, and Austria. And they all communicate and they all trade back and forth. And that was one of their advantages, is they now have information where no one else has it. This is the 1800s, because they have these branches of their bank everywhere, right? And then there's a war, and they find that their branches of these banks are on different sides of the war. This is the Napoleonic Wars. And not only that, but there's a lot of suspicion of them because they're Jews. And so people say like, okay, are you guys really, on our side? You guys are whatever. And so their main bank in Germany, all their mail is being stopped and being checked. The government decides they want to read all their mail, and they're going to hold it for 24 hours to make sure that they're not like spying, essentially. But this is a problem because a big part of their business relies on this quick passing of information So for example, there might be a certain currency that is selling for more money in one location than another. And so they're communicating all this stuff and they're saying, oh, we can buy the British pound for only this amount in Austria. Buy British pounds, because then you can move them here and I can sell them for more money, right? So this communication was really important. It had to be timely, right? Because they're doing a lot of currency transactions, doing a lot of arbitrage, which needs to happen right now. And so this 24-hour thing is just killing them. It completely removes all their alpha. It removes their competitive advantage. And so what they start doing is they come up with a code for the envelopes. And so they say, all right, if there's red stripes on the outside of the envelope, we're not going to be able to communicate anything else to you, but it means buy pounds, right? Or if it's like green stripes, then it means buy thalers. All these different currencies, buy Deutschmarks, sell Deutschmarks, whatever. And so that way they can just go to the post office, see the letters that are coming for them. They don't even have to open them and read the information. They just know actionably what they should do based on that information. They'll get the letter a day later and find out the background. And so I love that story of just like, look, this is the biggest obstacle in the world. It should just completely kill your business. And instead you just say, you know what, somehow I'm going to hack together a way to make this work. And so I think that persistence of I take ownership and it really doesn't matter what else happens, I'm going to find a way is another key.
Yeah, it's the little things. It's what's gonna stop you, right?
Totally.
So there's another person I wanted to ask you on. Oh, Walt Disney. Walt Disney, I think is a very interesting one because I remember even reading multiple threads and on Walt Disney, and I think I even saw like an early day business plan where he mapped out Disney before it became Disney. But would love to learn more about what your takeaways were when learning a lot about him.
Similar to Steve Jobs, Walt Disney was not similar to Steve Jobs. Steve could program a little bit, whatever. He knew hardware and he knew software and he could dabble, but he wasn't the world's greatest engineer. Similarly, Walt could draw, and Walt did draw initially, but he wasn't the world's greatest artist. And he similarly partnered with this guy, Iwerks, who was this incredible artist, and kind of powered him through his first iteration of Disney. And once again is like, okay, well, what do you do, Walt? You're not the world's greatest salesman. You can sell a little bit. He was not bad at sales. He's pretty good at sales, but wasn't the world's greatest salesman. He wasn't even Disney's greatest salesman. He wasn't Disney's greatest artist. He's their greatest writer. He wasn't actually writing the scripts. And once again, it comes back to this. Actually, it turns out leadership really matters and setting that vision. And that's what Walt Disney did. Another big takeaway for me that I found really interesting was actually he has big success, which is Snow White. That's like the biggest movie ever. Incredible. And they have a couple follow-ups that do okay. And then World War II hits, and actually like they have this big labor strike, and it creates really bad feelings, and that's horrible for Disney. And then World War II happens, and Disney kind of goes on pause because there's no consumer market because all the men are off in Europe or Asia fighting World War II. And also a lot of their corporate resources get used up helping to assist in World War II. So they are helping make instructional videos for American soldiers, things like that. And so it kind of goes on hiatus, Disney Studios. And when they come back, Walt is like not motivated anymore. It's kind of like the fun was all gone out of Disney Studios for him. And so he's kind of wandering in the desert for a while. And then what happens is he becomes obsessed with toy trains. And he loves just like building toy trains. And so he actually moves into a new house with a bigger yard so that he can build this almost life-size toy train in his backyard. It's like 2.5 feet tall, and you can kind of ride around on the top of the train. And at Disney Studios, he takes over like a big warehouse room to build these like enormous train tracks with these big toy villages. And at first people are like, Walt, this is crazy, dude. Like, what are you doing? You've got a studio to run. Let's try and turn this thing around. And you're playing with toy trains. And then, after taking over the studio, he thinks, well, what if we built it even bigger? What if we built it like half scale and you could walk through this entire thing? And he's like, no. What if we just built it full scale? And then that evolves and becomes Disneyland. And Disneyland is what becomes the next big success and kind of reignites and reinvigorates Disney. It makes it an attractive place to work once again, kind of reignites their film studio as well. And so to me, that's an example of this is someone who followed his obsession even when it seemed crazy to everyone else. And that was one thing I learned is sometimes you kind of just have to go down with the ship. Like you got to do what you believe in and what you're obsessed with, even if it seems like it doesn't make a ton of sense to be working on at the time.
Yeah, I really like the part where someone loses interest, because I don't think people understand how hard it is to stay focused on one thing, right? Like even like Michael Jordan, for example, at a certain point he stopped playing basketball and joined the MLB, right, for a little bit. So sometimes you just lose it, but I think as long as you follow that obsession, like you said, and what your gut's telling you, eventually it will lead you down the right path.
Well, I think Michael Jordan is like a perfect example, right? Because anyone on the outside would say, hey, this 2-year baseball intermission was totally not worth it. You wasted 2 years of your prime. And I think that makes a little bit of sense, but I think that's what made Michael Jordan, right? Is that this is someone who was completely consumed with what he did. And when basketball didn't consume him anymore, he wasn't going to do it. You know, he went and did baseball, which was obsessing him at the time. And so if he hadn't been the type of person who's going to say, even though I'm at the top, I'm going to leave basketball for 2 years to do exactly what I want to do, then he wouldn't have been Michael Jordan. So you just got to believe in yourself and do things even when they seem crazy.
Absolutely. So what's your goal with this podcast?
Right now, my goal is to grow it. I want to make it one of the biggest podcasts in the world. I want to make it the biggest history podcast in the world. And then we'll see.
Amazing. And I think you've already covered such amazing topics, and hopefully for anyone listening, just hearing some of these stories will get a lot of people excited to really learn deep in terms of the notes and research you're putting in for these topics. But I think you have an amazing niche. When I first did research on your podcast, I was like, wow, I've been curious about it, but I don't want to go do the research and read all these books and like figure out what's unique about each person. But I think, hey, if someone wants to, I think listening to your podcast is that great way to do it. So
thanks, man. Yeah, I mean, that's kind of how I think about it is there's this principle that Sean Puri talks about, which is hard to play, easy to win, easy to play, hard to win. In other words, it's really difficult to be the best sprinter in the world because everyone runs. It's really easy to play, right? And so we can be pretty confident that Usain Bolt is or was the fastest man in the world because if he wasn't, we would have found out. Someone else would have sprinted, if that makes sense. Whereas if you're the best pickleball player in the world, yeah, that was much easier to do, frankly, than what Usain Bolt did because it's just less people play. So I take that approach to podcasting, which is, look, if you want to do a podcast about comedy and MMA, then you better be funnier and more engaging than Joe Rogan. That's it. Like, and maybe you are, and if you are, then go for it. But if you're not, that's what you're going up against because it's easy to play and people are already in that space. And so for me, I'm like, I don't think I'm that funny. I don't think I'm like that charismatic or engaging. So I'm going to do something that's really hard, which is do a scripted podcast with a ton of research that just like is hard to do. And not many people are going to go to the effort. And therefore I think I can get to the top and be the best in this category. So that's how I think about it.
Awesome. Well, I appreciate you taking time to share more about your podcast, more about your learnings from researching very prominent figures in our past. And I hope, I'm gonna be an avid listener and just learning more because I think even some of the things you were talking about for Julius Caesar, I think really, really interested me. So
thanks, man. I appreciate it. I feel Timfluenced.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Cool, man. Well, thank you so much.